This is the fourth video in the Introduction to Simio Animation module, and in this video we'll focus on floor labels and dynamic label text. In particular, we'll first talk about floor labels attached to an entity, we'll then talk about general floor labels not attached to an entity, and finally we'll end with dynamic label text. In this module we'll use the standard source server sync model that we have used in the previous videos in this module, and if you didn't save that, you simply need to use a source object, a server object, a sync object, connect those with paths, add a default entity, and then use all the default properties for the model. First thing we'll look at is floor labels attached to entities. And so just as we saw when we looked at status labels, let me jump back into Simio here. In our model, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on our entity. The first thing we do is select the entity, and then up on the ribbon, the Object Tools ribbon, we can see the floor label right here. And so I'm just going to grab that, and then I'm going to draw the label as so, and give it a particular size. And you can see the text here. It's a little difficult to read. If you want to edit the text, you just click on the Edit button, and it brings up an edit box that has the text of the floor label. And there's some default text, and you can see the default text has different formatting codes, so you can use formatting codes to do things like bold and change the color of text that you see. If you just look at the default text is set up so that you can see some of that some of those different formatting options. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete all that text, and then I'm going to add the two components that we saw on the slide. Go back to the slide. We're interested in two things. We want to have the entity name, and we want to have the time that the entity was created. So it's a little difficult to see down here, so I'm going to do that right here. Let me go back into Simio, and I'm just going to type entity, and notice that I don't have any quotes or braces or anything, so it's just raw text. And when I want to access an expression in Simio, I use curly braces. And so what I want here is the entity name, because remember, this floor label is attached to the entity. So because it's attached to the entity, what we're actually getting here is model entity.name. We just don't have to qualify the model entity since it's attached. And then we'll just do created. Let me spell that right, created, and the expression is model entity.time created, but once again, since it's attached, we just need to do time created. And so now I click OK, and we can see that our text here, if I zoom in a little bit, we have entity, and it has a 0 value because we aren't running the simulation. Created also has a 0 value. So when I run my model now, you can see, let me run it a little bit, get to my second entity or so, and now we can see the attached text. So we have default entity 13 that was created at time 0.0075, so the time created is in the default time units of hours. Default entity.12 and its creation time, and so on. And in its standard format, the time created, we're just using the default real format. It's a little bit difficult to read, so let's stop the model here and let's go look at a couple of options for formatting that. So I'm going to open the edit, and because that's a little small for the video, I'm going to just copy the text there and paste it into a basic text editor so that I can just enlarge the size of the text so that you can see what I'm typing. So again, time created, because the floor label is attached to the entity, is actually the Simio expression model entity.time created. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to use the math round function. And the math round function says I want to take the real value and round to the specified number of decimal places. So in this case, I'm going to round the time created to 2 decimal places. So we go back and then just paste that in, Control V, and then when we run the model with the rounding function, let me get the 2. Yeah, you can see that we, instead of having that long text string, we just have a very short two places. But also note that because we only use 2 decimal places, we can't differentiate between these 2 times, because again, we're using time in hours. So if we wanted to change the time units, so let's go back and edit again. And this time let's just make one small change. Let me go back to my text editor so that you can see this. I'm going to take that value and multiply it by 60. And so multiplying it by 60, because the default time units is in hours, is going to give me time units of minutes. So we're going to do Control C, and paste it in here, Control V, and now when we run, instead of having time units of hours, we'll have time units of minutes. So let that run a little bit, and we can see now we have 0 0.6. Well, we still have 0 0.6, 0 0.6. So I guess we're creating things fairly close together. I could increase that length to 3 decimal places, or I could do it in seconds, whichever you prefer. But I think you can get the idea here that we can use that math round to round the expression value, round the numerical value to a specified number of decimal points. I could also use a string function if I wanted to achieve the same thing. So let me grab that and just say, let's go in here. Instead of using math round, I could use, oops, no, let's see here. There we go. Copied some strange characters there. Let me just get that back. There we go. So we have, instead of the math round function, this time I'm using string dot from real. And so that's just another built-in function that converts a real valued expression into a string. And that allows me to use the .NET formatting structure. And so this is something, if you look in the Simio help, it will give you another link that will provide details of how to use this type of formatting, but it lets me do any type of formatting that I'd like to do. It makes a lot more detailed formatting by actually converting the number to a string, and then I can embed that in other strings, so on and so forth. I can also adjust the text size, but note we're drawing in 3D, and so it's a little more complicated than just grabbing and expanding. So you might expect that if I expanded the text, that I expanded the box, that it would simply make the box a little bigger, but in fact it changes the text size also. And the reason is that the text is specified in characters per line, and so if I increase the width of the box, I'm still going to maintain this ratio of 20 characters per line. And so if I want the box to stay the same size and the text to get bigger, I simply go in and reduce the number of characters per line. So in this case, if I have 10 characters per line rather than 20, I'm going to see larger text. And another edit I can do is I can use a fixed font rather than a proportional font. And so if I wanted to, say, align things on a colon, and I have different different numbers of characters in my strings, if I have a proportional font, it's difficult to do alignment. If I have a fixed font, I'm able to align that. So I can change the font value that way. I can change the font value and style that way. And finally, I can also change the background color. If I want to change the color, I can say make it a light blue. Let's make it just a little bit bigger, or the font a little smaller so that we can actually see it. And now when I run, I can see the oops, stop that. I can see the formatted text. In this case, I use the fixed font, and because the name is large, I wrap the string, so I would probably want to go back and format this a little bit more. So I could go back and, let's say, increase this just a little bit more so that I get more characters per line. And let's see, still don't have enough space, but I think you can get the point that I can adjust the text. So it's a two-step process for adjusting the font size and the label size. I have to do that in combination, the box size and then the characters per line to get the precise formatting that you'd like to have. We can also have floor labels that are not attached to an entity, so similar to the status labels that we saw before, rather than moving with an entity, they will be in a fixed location. And as we see here on the PowerPoint, we can also use these as what we would call a sign or a TV, which I'm going to demonstrate by using the height. So by using the object height, we can have this show up as sort of a sign that you would see inside the model, or a TV view. So let's jump back into the model here. Our simple model here. This is our source server sync. And so if I just go to the drawing ribbon, I can have a floor label. And this time, let's create this, and let's just use the standard. Let's just use the standard text. So I'm not going to go in and make any changes. I'm just going to have the standard text that we see, or the default text that we see when we place the floor label that has the formatting that we talked about before. And let me change the background color so that we can see it a little easier. Let's make it the nice purple that we saw in the in the video in the PowerPoint. And so when we run the model, you can see that the status label shows up. I'm sorry, the floor label here just shows up at a fixed place on the floor of the model, whereas the one attached to the entity moves with the entity. So now in terms of making this into a sign, I can go back and let me stop the model and go back into 2D mode. And let me select the entity and then go to the drawing ribbon, and we have the object height. So this time I'm going to make a height, and before I do that I'm just going to take a quick little measurement here and say this looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 total meters. So I'm going to make this 5 meters tall. It looks like I need to make it just a little bit bigger. Let's make it 6 meters tall. And now when I run the model and then go to 3D mode, you can see that what's happened is we now have a three-dimensional object that is the width, the x and z that we drew, and then the y value that we typed in. And as you can see, the label text is on the front, and it's also on the top. And so as I mentioned before, when we say changing the font size is a little bit more complicated than just specifying size. We also have to do the size of the box. This is the reason for that. And so we can place these in the anywhere we want in the facility. And so depending on what you're modeling, this provides a really nice way to have status text so that it tells the reader what's going on, so that when you're moving around in 3D you can describe what's going on in the model, which is really what's happening in the one in the video. I'm sorry, in the PowerPoint. In the PowerPoint it's talking, this particular floor label is describing what's going on in the model. As with the floor labels attached to entities, we can also use semio expressions in the exact same way. We just specify those semio expressions using curly braces, and so these type of floor labels provide a really nice way to provide information about performance metrics as the model is running. So the last thing we'll look at in this video is the dynamic label text. And so this lets us create a label that is attached to dynamic entities. And how this differs from floor labels or from status labels is that it's always visible and upright regardless of the zoom level. So I can zoom in, zoom out, and I can always see the label. I can also use expressions, and in this case I can use table references, which we see an example of here. The one I'm going to demonstrate in our model though is this one. So I'm going to just take the create time plus string dot new line plus string from real entity time created, and let's diagnose this, or let's decipher what's going on here. So I'm creating a string that is going to be using the semio expression entity dot time created. I'm converting that to a real, and then I'm creating a two-line label. So I have create time, and then I'm going to have a new line, and then I'm going to have the time created that we see right here. Also note that the one that we see has been rounded and also has a minutes, or an MIN, and so that's not shown here. So we can go into our model. This is just our base model again, and I'm going to grab my default entity, go to animation over here, right there. If I can get my mouse there we go. Let's make that a little bit bigger. And down here we see dynamic label text, and so I've already copied into the clipboard that string function just so I don't have to type the whole thing. Make that a little bigger, and I can then just paste that in. And so this is the one from the slide where we see create time plus string dot new line plus string from real time created. And so let me move this over here and then run the model. And you can see that we have our two-line label. So we have the create time, and then we have the string version of the created time. As I said, in the one that you saw in the video, we have two additional components that aren't shown here. One is that we've rounded the time, and we've also added an additional text for min. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let you try that on your own. But once again, the basic idea of using a dynamic value is that when I run the model, if I move this over a little bit, regardless of how I'm zoomed in or out or in 3D mode or whatever, the values, no matter where I'm looking from, the dynamic label is always upright and at the appropriate viewing size. And so that's what makes it a very useful component for animations.